Chapter 6, The Chief is Dead, Long Live the Chief. He got to school early by running all the way. The first thing he did was to head for the school library shelves for a book on Indians, and to his joy, he soon found one under the section labeled Peoples of the World, a book called On the Trail of the Iroquois. He couldn't take it out because there was nobody there to write it down for him, but he sat down there and then on the bench and began to read about it. Now remember, Iroquois is the tribe that Little Bear belongs to. Now, Omri was not what you would call a great reader. He couldn't get into books somehow unless he knew them already, and how, as his teacher never tired of asking, was he ever going to get to know any more books until he read them for the first time? And this, On the Trail of the Iroquois, was not exactly a comic book. Tiny print, hardly any pictures, and no fewer than 300 pages. Getting into this was obviously out of the question, so Omri just dipped. He managed to find out one or two fairly interesting things straight away. Iroquois Indians were sometimes called the Five Nations. One of the five were the Mohawks, a tribe Omri had heard of. They had indeed lived in longhouses, not teepees, and their main food had been maize, M-A-I-Z-E, and squash, whatever they were, and beans. These vegetables had, for some strange reason, been called the Three Sisters. There were many mentions of the Algonquins as the Iroquois' enemies, and Omri confirmed that the Iroquois had fought beside the English, while the Algonquins fought for the French sometime in the 1700s, and that both sides had scalped like mad. At this point, he began to get really interested. The book, in its terribly grown-up way, was trying to tell him something about why the Indians had done such a lot of scalping. Omri had always thought it was just an Indian custom, but the book seemed to say that it wasn't that at all, and at least not until the white man came. The white man seemed to have made the Iroquois and the Algonquin enjoy or keen on scalping each other, not to mention white men, French or English as the case may be, by offering them money and whiskey and guns. Omri was deep in the book, frowning heavily several minutes after the bell had rung. Someone had to tap him on the shoulder and tell him to hurry on to assembly. So every morning when they start school, they all meet in maybe the gym or an auditorium, and they have an assembly first. So they all talk to the principal, which they call, in England, they call the headmaster. The morning lasted forever, and 3 times his teacher had cause to tell Omri to wake up. And at last Patrick leaned over and whispered, "You're even dreamier today than usual. What's up?" "I'm thinking about your Indian." "Listen," hissed Patrick, "I think you're putting me on about that Indian. It's nothing so marvelous. You can buy them for a few cents at Yaps." Yaps was their local newsagent and toy shop. "I know, and all the equipment for them. I'm going shopping at lunch break. Are you coming?" "We're not allowed out of school at lunch unless we eat at home. You know that." "I'm going anyway. I've got to." "Go after school." "No, I have to get home after school." "What? You're not going to stay and skateboard?" "Omri and Patrick, will you kindly stop chattering?" said the teacher. They stopped. At long last, lunchtime came. "I'm going. Are you coming?" "No, there'll only be trouble." "I can't help that." "You're a twit." Twit or not, Omri sneaked out, ran across the playground through a hole in the fence. The front gate was kept locked to keep the children from going in the road, and in 5 minutes, by running all the way, he had reached Yaps. The selection of plastic figures was good there. So they have a toy store kind of near their school, and they sell a bunch of toys, and so there's this whole box full of little plastic characters. There was one whole box of mixed cowboys and Indians, and Omri searched till he found a chief wearing a cloak and a full feather headdress, with a bow in his hand and a quiver full of arrows slung across his back. Omri bought it with part of his lunch money and rushed back to school before he could be missed. He showed the chief to Patrick. "Why'd you get another Indian?" "Only for the bows and arrows." Patrick was now looking at him like he'd gone completely screwy. And in the afternoon, mercifully, they had 2 periods of handicrafts. So handicrafts would be like art class, and they have 2 periods of it on this particular day. Omri had completely forgotten to bring the teepee he made, but there were plenty of scraps of felt, sticks, needles, and thread lying about in the handicrafts room. And soon he made another one much better than the first. Sewing had always bored him rigid, but now he sat for half an hour stitching away without even looking up. He was trying to achieve the patched look of a real teepee made of odd-shaped pieces of hide, and he also found a way of bracing the sticks so they didn't fold up every time they were nudged. "Very good, Omri," remarked his teacher several times. "What patience all of a sudden." Omri, who usually liked praise as much as anyone, could hardly hear. He was concentrating so hard. After a long time, he became aware that Patrick was standing over him, breathing through his nose rather noisily to attract his attention. "Is that for my Indian?" "My Indian, yeah." "Why are you doing it in bits like that?" "To be like a real one." "Real ones have designs on them." "So will this. He's going to paint proper Iroquois ones." "Who is?" "Little Bear, that's his name." Why not just call him Running Nose? Asked Patrick with a grin. Ammi looked at him blankly. Because his name is Little Bear, he said. Patrick stopped grinning and he frowned. I wish you'd stop this stupid business, he said peevishly, going on like it wasn't a joke. Ammi went on looking at him for a moment and then went back to the bracing. Each pair of sticks had to have another short stick glued between them. It was quite tricky. Patrick stood a minute and then said, Can I come home with you today? No, I'm sorry. Why not? Mom's having guests, Ammi mumbled. He didn't tell lies very well, and Patrick knew at once it was a lie, and he was hurt. All right, be like that then, he said, and he stalked off furiously. The afternoon ended at last, and Ammi accomplished the walk home, which would have normal dawdling might have taken half an hour, in a little more than 10 minutes. He arrived sorely out of breath and greeted his surprised mother. Have you developed a jet engine, or did you get expelled, she said. And he was gasping, and a request he wanted to go straight to his room without waiting for tea. What have you been up to in there? There's an awful mess on the floor, and it looks like bits of grass and bark, and where did you get that beautiful little Indian teepee? I think it's made of real Indian leather. Ammi looked at her speechless. He began at last. Telling lies to Patrick was one thing, but lying to his mother was quite something else, and he never did it unless the emergency was dire. But mercifully the phone rang just then, so he was spared for the moment, and he dashed upstairs. And there was indeed a fair old mess, though no worse than he often left himself when he'd been working on something. Little Bear and the horse were nowhere to be seen, but Ammi guessed where to look behind the dressing-up crate. Wow, a wonderful sight met his eyes. A longhouse, not finished but no less interesting and beautiful for that, stood on the seed box, whose smooth surface was now much trampled over. There were hoof as well as moccasin prints. Ammi saw that a ramp made of part of bark had been laid against the side of the wooden box, on which the horse had been led up, and to Ammi's delight, odd as it may seem, there was a tiny pile of horse manure laying on the ramp as proof that the horse was alive. And there he was, tied by a thread to an upright twig, hammered presumably into the ground, munching a small pile of grass that the Indian had carried up for him. Little Bear himself was still working, so intently that he didn't even notice that he was not alone. And Ammi watched him in utter fascination. The longhouse was about half finished. The twigs, which had been taken from the birch tree on the lawn, had been stripped of their bark, leaving them shining white. Each one had been bented like an arch, and the ends thrust into the earth, and cross pieces lashed to the sides with thread. More and more twigs, which were stout poles to the Indian, had been added, with never a nail or a screw needed to strengthen the structure. And now Little Bear had begun to fix flakes of bark like tiny tiles onto the cross pieces. So remember, Little Bear is building a longhouse, which is what Iroquois lived in back in those days. They didn't live in teepees. They lived in these longhouses. And Little Bear is doing all the building himself. He was seated on the roof itself, his feet locked around the main roof pole, which ran the length of the house, hanging these bark tiles, each of which would have to be first carefully shaped with his knife. The knight's battle axe, remember Ammi brought a shining knight in shining armor to life, took the axe and then shut the door again and made him plastic again. The knight's battle axe lay on the ground beside an unused pile of twigs. It had clearly been used to chop and strip them, and had been made to serve Little Bear's purpose very well. At last Ammi saw him straighten up, stretch his arms toward the ceiling, and open his mouth in a tremendous noisy yawn. Tired? He said to Little Bear. Little Bear got such a fright he almost fell off the longhouse roof, and the horse neighed and tugged at his rope. But then Little Bear looked up and saw Ammi hanging over the crate far above him, and he grinned. So let's take a look at what this longhouse looks like. Can you see that? It's really cool. He's got these pieces of these sticks and pieces of bark, and he's making a roof on there, and he's working really hard. Little Bear tired, work many hour, look, make longhouse, work for many braves, I make alone. Also, not got good tools, axe Ammi give heavy, why no tomahawk? Ammi was getting used to the Indians' ungrateful ways and was not offended. He showed him the teepee he'd made. I suppose you won't want this now that you've got your longhouse, he said rather sadly. Want? Want? He seemed to have decided teepees had their uses after all. He circled it. Good, give paints, make pictures. Ammi unearthed his poster paints. When he came back with them, he found Little Bear sitting cross-legged on the earth, facing the figure of that chief, the plastic chief that Ammi had just bought, that Ammi had put next to the teepee, and Little Bear was clearly puzzled. It's called plastic, said Ammi. I bought it in a shop. Plastic? Little Bear stared at the figure with its big feather headdress. You make magic, get bow and arrows from plastic? Yeah. Also make feathers real? He asked with a gleam in his eye. Yeah, you like that headdress? Little Bear like, but that for Chief. Little Bear not chief till father die. But you could just try it on. Little Bear looked doubtful, but he nodded. Make real, then see. So Omri shut that Indian chief in the cupboard, and before he turned the key, he leaned down to where Little Bear was examining, to him, the enormous pots of paint. Little Bear, are you lonely? Huh? Would you like a friend? Got friend, said the Indian, jerking his head toward the horse. He thinks his horse is his friend. I meant, like, do you want another Indian? Little Bear looked up swiftly, his hands still, and there was a long silence. Wife? He asked at last. No, I mean, this is a man, said Omri. The chief? Not one, said Little Bear immediately, and went back to his work with a bent head. Omri was disappointed. He thought it might be fun to have 2 Indians, but somehow he couldn't do anything Little Bear didn't want. He would have to treat his chief as he had treated the knight, grab the weapons and turn him back into plastic again at once. Only this time it was not as easy. When he opened the cupboard, the chief was still sitting on the shelf, looking up at him in bewilderment, blinking as the light struck his eyes. And Omri saw at once that he was a very old man, covered in wrinkles. He took the bow out of his hands quite easily, but the quiver full of arrows was hung around him in a leather thong, and as for actually lifting the feathered headdress clean off the gray old head, Omri found that he just couldn't bring himself to do it. It seemed so rude. The old man gazed at him blankly at first, and then with dawning terror. But he didn't get up, and he didn't speak, although Omri saw his lips moving and noticed he had hardly any teeth. Omri felt he should offer the old chief some friendly words to reassure him, so he held up one hand as he saw sometimes people did in movies when they were treating and talking to Indian chiefs, and he said, How? The old Indian lifted a trembling hand, and then suddenly he slumped onto his side. Little Bear, quick, get onto my hand. Omri reached down, and Little Bear climbed on his hand from the longhouse roof. What? The old Indian, I think he fainted. He carried Little Bear to the cupboard, and Little Bear stepped off onto the shelf. He stooped down beside the crumpled figure. Taking the single feather out of the back of his own headband, he held it in front of the old man's mouth, and then he shook his head. Dead. He said, no breath. Heart stop. Old man. Gone to ancestors. Very happy. Without more ado, he began to strip the body, taking the headdress, the arrows, the big, richly decorated cloak for good measure. And Omri was shocked. Little Bear, stop! Surely you shouldn't. Chief dead. I only other Indian here. No one else to be chief. Little Bear chief now, he said, whirling the cloak about his own bare shoulders and clapping the splendid circle of feathers onto his head with a flourish. He picked up the quiver. Omri, give bow, he commanded, and it was a command, and Omri obeyed it without thinking. Now, you make magic. Deer for Little Bear hunt, fire for cook, good meat. He folded his arms, scowling up at Omri. Omri was quite taken aback by all this. While giving Little Bear every respect as a person, he was not about to be turned into a slave. So can you imagine he makes a deer come to life, a plastic deer, and then sets him free in the room, and then Little Bear shoots it? That doesn't sound very good, does it? He began to wonder if giving him those weapons, let alone making him into a chief, was such a good idea. Now look here, Little Bear, he began in a teacher's tone. Omri! It was his father's voice, fairly roaring at him from the foot of the stairs, and Omri jumped, bumping the cupboard, and Little Bear fell over backwards, considerably spoiling his dignity. Yeah? Come down here this instant! Omri had no time for courtesies. He snatched Little Bear up, set him down near his half-finished longhouse, shut and locked the cupboard, and ran downstairs. His father was waiting for him. Omri, have you been in the greenhouse lately? And did you, while you were there, remove a seed tray planted out with marrow seeds, may I ask? Well, yes or no? Well, yeah, but... And is it possible that in addition you have been hacking at the trunk of the birch tree and tore off strips of bark? But, Dad, it was only... Don't you know trees can die if you strip too much of their bark off? It's like their skin. And as for the seed tray, that was mine. You had no business taking things from the greenhouse, and you know it. Now I want it back, and you better not have disturbed the seeds, or heaven help you. Omri swallowed hard. He and his father stared at each other. I can't give it back, he said at last. But I'll buy you another tray and some more seeds. I've got enough money, please. He can't give it back because what just happened on the seed tray? Little Bear just built a longhouse on it, right? Ami's father did have a quick temper, especially about anything concerning the garden, but he was not unreasonable, and above all, he was not the sort to pry into his children's secrets. He realized at once that his seed tray was lost to him forever, and it was no use hectoring Ami about it. All right, he said. You can go to the hardware shop and buy them, but I want them today. Ami's face fell. Today? But it's nearly 5 o'clock now. Precisely. Be off. So his dad is not happy that he took those things.